All right, welcome to Apologetic Showdown. After a long hiatus, I'm here with John Buck, Josh Brister, and Andrew Stratelates, if I'm pronouncing that right. And we're going to talk about Catholicism and Protestantism and Anglicanism. And there wasn't audio. Oh well. Anyways, I hope you can hear me now. And yeah, if you guys want to
Well,
introduce
I think
yourself, yeah, go ahead.
I hope we can discuss how the Catholic Church, why, if you're hearing this, if you're listening to this podcast on YouTube or whatever, why should you be a Christian? Why should you be a Catholic, or at least consider that an Orthodox? A high churchman, someone that takes the Catholic Church seriously, because I think it does confront culture in a number of ways, and I think it's very reasonable. Anyway, my name is Josh Brister. I've been studying philosophy and theology and different subjects for a while, and I hope this podcast can help delineate some of the reasons why we should stand up for truth, beauty, and goodness. Those things that are transcendentals, that point to God. So I think we should stand up for the Catholic Church, for Western civilization. If we don't stand up now, we may lose it. So thank you very much.
Very nice. Yeah. I'm John Buck. I just recently entered into the Catholic Church this Easter. It was surprisingly quick, actually, since only, well, I don't know. In some sense, there's a slow burn because my first introduction to probably even finding Catholicism somewhat plausible was probably through Ed Fazer, and that was back in the latter end of 2017. And then from there, became very, very much a fan of sort of Thomistic argumentation and theology. And sort of held that even as a neo-Protestant, I guess. And then only very recently came into the Catholic Church. Just we can go into that a little bit further. But yeah, that's sort of my just basic bio. Andrew, you want to say something? There you
Sure. Go. Hey everyone, I'm Andrew Stratelates. I'm mostly on Twitter right now. My interests are in apologetics, philosophy, cultural stuff, and various other things. I am a traditional Anglican and have been an Anglican for about, at this point, 15 or 16 years. Before that, I was a relatively serious agnostic and grew up from a Lutheran background. So, yeah, that's me.
Nice.
So do we want to maybe sort of lay out some of our, in principle, reasons for why we think, if you were to take one main reason why you think, why you became a Catholic, or why you think Catholicism is true, or at least sort of the high church element of Christianity is something to be favored over, say, a low church element, if you want to be more broad to include Andrew here. Do you want to start, Josh?
Sure, I guess. Well, as I said in my intro, when in our daily lives, we use concepts that point to something, that point to God, even if we have a limited understanding of God. God is, he's in his own genus. He can't be really, put in among other gods. God is the ground of being. So I think goodness, truth, and beauty in the world, the things we see around us, all point to something transcendently true, and something that grounds reality. Plato and Aristotle, the pre-Socratics and the Socratics, they all dealt with the one and many problem, or becoming, or change, and being, or a static state. Now, to account for both of those things, you need something. You need something that will account for them. And I think God, a transcendent being, accounts for the possibility and the actuality of change. We're not going to say it's an illusion, and of being itself. There must be something prime, something that's pure form, that exists necessarily, that has no room for potentiality. I view various arguments that point this way also, but I believe that common sense also leads that way in our everyday discourse and communication. I guess I'll stop right there. I've spoken enough.
Yeah, no, that's good what you brought up there about, especially the sort of classical theistic understanding of God as pure act over that of, say, maybe the neoclassical understanding of God as maybe a type of being that exists, but it's just happened, like we stand in relation to it, so that it's the creator of our world and things like that.
Yeah. In that respect, I think a lot of the atheist objections are really just caricatures. I've dialogued with a few of the top atheists, and I'm not persuaded in the least. I think Thomas Aquinas, Aristotle before him, but Thomas Aquinas, Boethius, and there's so many others, Augustine, really have already done the work. It's more difficult. Something that's difficult is arguing with God. That's where you can't get around your conscience. That objective moral law within you really bears down on a person and really convicts a person. Now, is that just a mere subjective thing? Well, no, that's not a good argument. So I'm really not convinced about the atheist objections, because I really think a lot of it is based on a caricature or a misunderstanding. You hear this when you read Richard Dawkins' book or Sam Harris. I read them, I look at their arguments, and they're so simplistic. And so I really think when we come down to it, it's really about, are we going to follow God or not? I think the choices are clear, and I think Protestants actually got this right too. Pascal or Kierkegaard, his yes or no, we have an ultimate choice to whether to follow God or not. And I don't think it's based on a 50-50 chance whether God exists or not. I think it's immensely reasonable and rational to believe in God. Sorry to keep going on there.
No, yeah, it's good. That's the I think with the understanding of classical theism and how, especially its being so closely tied to the Christian tradition, it's something that I think the Protestants sort of put aside too quickly. And I don't know, that's probably for myself one of the main critiques, I guess, that I have of Protestantism or low church in general, is just how contiguous they are, or separate from history that they are, especially in their theology, but also in their tradition and their understanding of the Christian way of life. I think that if you go back to some of the earliest church fathers, the people that are the biggest defenders of the faith in its sort of prime growth, that you'll find a lot closer elements there, like a belief in the real presence in the Eucharist, or the forgiveness of sins from a priest. And I think you'll find those elements that are still there within, say, the Orthodox Church or the Catholic Church, and even the Anglican Church, or at least Lutheran Church is still somewhat there with the belief in consubstantiation. But I think a lot of Protestants just are born into a tradition that's their Christian tradition, and they don't have very close ties to the history of where their tradition even came from. That I think that it's very fruitful just to look back over to read some of the works of, say, Irenaeus, or Augustine, or Thomas Aquinas, especially. He's not a church father, of course, though. But just to see, because a lot of the problems that they were sort of dealing with in their time, you'll see them today as well.
Before Andrew comes, I just want to say, yeah, a lot of people, and this isn't just from atheists. Maybe it's also from Baptist and so forth, from which I used to be at one time. Look at the past as, well, they didn't know nothing, or they look at it from a historical snobbery point of view. I think that's the atheist's main, one of the main critiques I have of atheism, the snobbery of the past. Look, we all recognize, even though maybe we have problems defining, but we all recognize the truth, the true, the beautiful, and the good. And what institution down through history has, even though it has faltered at certain points, because we're all men and we all have sin, but what institution has exemplified those things? If God really does exist, which I think we can all give arguments for, it seems reasonable that he would have established a church to preserve his words. That being said, I do believe the Catholic Church is the one true church. But I also believe that denominations have a less developed portrait of God and theology. When you look at history, there's no reason to be skeptical, especially of the existence of God or the Catholic Church. I think there's good reasons to believe that the church has preserved the teachings of Jesus. So I'm not going to go on more until we progress. But Andrew, would you like to come in?
Sure. I guess I'll tell a little bit of my story and sort of what is important in these Christian traditions that preserve the sort of ancient church understanding of things. That there's a key part of two things, right? One is engaging the intellectual faculties of people to wrestle with these problems in a holistic way. And the other thing is to have a connection to history. If we were Stoics or Platonists, we might not be concerned with that, but the Christian understanding is that God is a God who's active in history, and specifically through the Hebrew people and his church. And that's sort of the key thing, is that if you look at temple worship as described in the Old Testament and Revelation, the practices of liturgical Christianity are entirely the same as temple worship, with a few interesting modifications. One of the strongest or most interesting changes is the Eucharist in Christian liturgy takes the place of the Torah in the rabbinical Jewish liturgy. And there's some things there, but the form is the same. The engagement of the whole being intellectually, physically in the liturgy, communally in the life of the parish, is all there in sort of its equal billing. And some denominations, there's a distortion or a lack of one of those two, more less of the complete thing, right?
Yeah.
Hey, Caleb, I know you were raised in the Catholic faith, but I'm just curious if you want to sort of go over your main reasons why what you find like why you stayed within it, even like with all your intellectual wrestlings that you go through.
Yeah. Well, why are you a Catholic today? Why are you still a
Yeah.
Catholic?
Yeah. Well, I don't really want to focus as much on like the theism and Christian argument since it's more on particular Catholicism, Protestant discussion. So I'll just focus on that. But I would just say that I just think that Catholicism makes the most sense out of particular features of the gospel, like Jesus' statements, like in John's gospel, which we would take as to be about the Eucharist. Of course, Protestants will generally disagree on that, or like giving the apostles the authority to forgive sins. But, like Protestants can give interpretations of those passages, I think, that aren't the Catholic interpretation, but I don't really find those interpretations as plausible. And then also looking at like church history, it just makes a lot of sense just looking at the liturgical developments and this intellectual history of Catholicism. To me is just it's just more profound than Protestantism. So it's just kind of a cumulative case when you take in all the factors. It just seems like Catholicism makes more sense of scripture and church history than Protestantism does. So.
Yeah, just to go into what you were saying there about John, like especially John 6, where you have the sort of explicit connections to the Eucharist. I think having a historical, like looking at that chapter through a sort of historical lens, I think lends a lot more credence towards the Catholic or Orthodox interpretation than it does to the Protestant one, especially given the fact that like John's disciple himself, Ignatius, has writings in explicit affirmation of the real presence within the Eucharist. And so there's that, and especially within like the very early church, that whole, so it seems to me that like, how are we supposed to interpret John here? We have the Catholic interpretation and we have the Protestant interpretation. If John was writing to particular readers, and if we have the writings of the people that he was basically writing to, then I think we can use their writings to understand like how was John originally interpreted. And that's how we're supposed to understand which interpretation of John is most accurate. So that would be, I guess, in a sense, originalist. That's only the term I heard about through the whole Amy Coney Barrett sort of going on in politics. But I just found it a very interesting sort of way of interpreting the Bible, especially those passages very early in the Christian history, given the fact that we know how at least many of the Christians following those original writings, how they interpreted it. And that gives us a better reason to think that interpretation is more appropriate than some interpretation that might have been concluded at 1500 years after the fact.
Well, I'll be even more radical, right? Is that one of the things that is really important is, unlike Islam, Christ did not write the books of the Bible. The books of the Bible are the written records of the civilization that Christ founded. So in a very real sense, if you are just looking at the text of the Bible, or even just the text of the fathers without the living tradition that has been passed down from person to person, it's sort of like trying to learn how to be a surgeon by only reading Gray's Anatomy, right? With a lot of luck and a lot of grace, you can get on target. But it's going to be a lot easier to go to medical school rather than trying to teach yourself out of Gray's Anatomy alone.
Yeah, especially given the fact that within the tradition, that's where we get most of our beliefs nowadays. Like, it's only because of people like Augustine, Justin Martyr, Ignatius, Irenaeus, that we still have Christianity today, because they were sort of the figureheads for Christianity of their time period. And we're a lot of, like, we stand on the shoulders of giants. And so it's very I don't know, I guess in a sense disrespectful. Maybe that's just part of my conservatism coming out, that we're disregarding the early Christian interpretations of these passages, given the fact that we very much are relying upon them to give us what we have now. Like, we have the Bible in its canon because of the works of all the early church fathers that were doing the hard work of translating and creating copies and sending out those copies. And it's like, what other historical document from that time period do we have such great amounts of copies of and interpretations of, and all of that? Yeah, go ahead.
That's what C.S. Lewis in one of his books talked about, historical snobbery or chronological snobbery, when you view traditions or the past, and you really don't take them into account, and you just dismiss them, and you view like whatever is new is good and whatever is old is bad or outdated. That's just not true. It's not wise. It's not wisdom. And it reminds me of Bart Ehrman, when he he questions. He comes from a very skeptical viewpoint, and as a lot of Ehrman's interlocutors have commented, if his skepticism towards the New Testament were applied to other historical documents, then we should be skeptical of other historical events and other documents that don't have the author's names on them, but were very familiar within the communities. And plus, the New Testament writers and those after, like Ignatius and Irenaeus, and Polycarp and some others, they believed that there was a strong tradition of the traditional authors having written the books of the New Testament. And you have various types of witnesses, or witnesses close to the eyewitnesses. So you have a line of living tradition. Here's his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses by Richard Bauckham. He discusses this. You have a line of a living eyewitness tradition that goes back, that the early fathers, Clement of Rome and others, talk about. So, and they corroborate some of those traditions, like the presence of Jesus in the Eucharist and so forth. So we have an abundance of reasons to. We should be more charitable when we look at the past and when we look at these traditions.
Yeah, Caleb, did you want to respond to that comment that you pinned up there?
Yeah, I didn't mean to leave it pinned for that long, but I mean, this is our first Protestant or specific Protestant type objection in the chat from Ron, so maybe we can respond to this. Now, I do have a video giving my whole response on that, so I'd recommend Ron watch that if he hasn't. But if you guys want to respond to that, maybe, because I think that's a pretty big issue. But yeah.
Yeah, I can't see it.
Yeah, so he's saying John 6 isn't talking about the Last Supper. I guess the alternative interpretation would be that taking up, eating the body of Christ, or eating, let's see, John 6 exactly, the exact terminology, because it's something about like, truly he who eats my flesh shall have eternal life, I think. Yes, the Protestant interpretation would be that whoever sort of takes up my mantle or lives as I do, maybe, will be able to have the same sort of rewards that I offer.
Yeah, 53 is sort of the, or like 52, 53 is roughly where it starts. And basically, yeah, the question that I have, right, is this is not a narrative or a description of the Last Supper, but it is a description of some sort of theological point, right? And the sacramental Christians will be like, well, he is describing the necessity or the sufficiency of Eucharist as a sacramental transformation for salvation, right? Because he talks about eating his flesh and blood, and then the disciples say, "This is a hard saying. Who can understand it?" And Christ's response is, "Does this offend you?" And basically talks a bit about grace. And then a lot of them, after his response to this, stop following him, right?
Yeah.
And so it seems very plausible to me that this is describing a real presence Eucharistic theology, right? Even though the Eucharist isn't there yet and the sacrifice on Calvary hasn't been made yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even the fact that in the other Gospels, when he says, "This is my body, take, eat of this," that was technically prior to the crucifixion as well. But yeah, it still seems like it has that very much sort of sacramental language, and also the explicit command given to his apostles there to do this in remembrance of me, and that word "do" is very much a sort of imperative. I think also, like even if that's not referring to, because it's not the Last Supper of, say, Passover that we see in the other Gospels. John's Gospel has sort of Passover and his offering up is sort of a different timeline, it seems. Even within Paul's work, so 1 Corinthians, 11, that talks about
13? Is it 11?
Yeah, 11. So now then, when you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper you eat. For as you eat, each of you goes ahead without sharing his meal, while one remains hungry and another gets drunk. Don't you have your own homes in which to eat and drink, or do you despise the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What can I say to you? Shall I praise you for this? No, I will not. So 23, for I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." 27, therefore, whoever eats the bread and drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of sinning against the body and blood of the Lord. Each one must examine himself before he eats of the bread and drinks of the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without recognizing the body eats and drinks judgment on himself. That is why many among you are weak and sick, and a number of you have fallen asleep. So, like, even if it's somewhat like unclear what Jesus is talking about, either in any of the Gospels, I think the way that Paul sort of passes on what he's taken from within that community very much falls in line with sort of the Catholic teaching in regards to the Eucharist. Now, there may be sort of a Protestant spin to be able to take on this as well, and that's very much they're welcome to have that particular interpretation. I just think that given the extensive history of the Christian Church with regarding the Lord's Supper as very much sacramental and having that sort of real presence, I think, I don't know, I think the Protestant has very weak footing in which to sort of hold on to their alternate interpretations.
Well, part of it is, especially compared to a modern, right? Be they a modern low church Protestant or a modern secular, you have a very different metaphysic underline your understanding of reality, right? Of either something Platonic or Aristotelian, where symbols and essences are fundamental things, right? Well, if we show this to a materialist, right, and said this is true, or whatever, that they would necessarily have to interpret all of it symbolically, right, as that this is symbolically doing something rather than articulating the underlying reality. And that's one of the problems too, and one of the divergences that sort of happens with this sort of modern thought and compared to the classical thought.
Right. Yeah. One of the things that I don't know, I hear from Catholic apologists that I think is at least gives some reason to think, gives the Christian at least some reason to think that the Eucharistic miracle is at least possible, is given the fact that Jesus in his sort of resurrected body was able to change his appearance in such a way that his own disciples weren't able to recognize him. So like we know from the gospel accounts that was actually Jesus there talking with him, walking along the road with him, having this interesting conversation with him for a long while, until at the very end do they recognize, oh, that was Jesus. Oh my gosh. So that at least gives some reason to think that in his sort of restored body, he's able to change his appearance. Now, we don't have an exact explicit example of Christ changing his appearance to not just be another person, but to have all the appearances of an actual wafer and the same taste and the same ability to provide nutrition. But it's at least gives a prima facie reason to think that it's at least possible for God to have a different substance than what it appears to be. Yeah.
So, and this is a tangent, but a interesting articulation of it that's relatively popular in Lutheran circles. They tend to follow something called sacramental union, is that Christ as the Logos is the underlying reality of everything. And in some sense, Christ is underneath everything. And in the Eucharist, it's just the intensity of Christ's underlyingness of the elements goes up, a millionfold compared to normal reality.
Yeah. So it sounds, I guess in a sense I can kind of buy that, because I know within Orthodox theology, there's still that sort of almost panentheism that all of reality requires God within it to sort of retain its structure. And there's an aspect of that within, I guess, the Thomistic understanding of God as sort of the ground of all being. But I don't think that it stands out as significant enough to say that, it's a difference in degree rather than a difference in kind. I think there is a difference in kind that occurs when God becomes incarnate in the Virgin Mary. And I where previously God's presence was not in bodily form, and then there was. And in the same sort of sense, I think that in order to take that as sort of the most significant event to ever occur in history, you'll have to also say that the real presence in the Eucharist is something of a sort of difference in kind rather than an increase in degree. I don't know. That's just my sort of immediate thoughts on that. I haven't really studied too much on the Lutheran understanding of consubstantiation, though.
Yeah, and it's been a while, and C.S. Lewis has this great pithy phrase, which is, the command is take, eat, not take, understand.
Right.
And I will pull out the Anglican card, which is, as long as you understand that Christ is really present, that the exact metaphysical details are very secondary, and it's about taking it worthily. So, yeah,
this might be a sort of side topic.
This is.
Yeah, go ahead, Josh.
Well, I was just going to say, this is why not every willy-nilly interpretation is valid, but why we need a structure. And I think the church, and I think the Catholic Church is the best candidate for that. In tradition, to keep safeguards on what is meant in the text. So, yeah, that's all I had to say.
No, yeah, that's a good point, and I think that's something else that really puts the high church elements of Christianity apart from the lower church elements, is the fact that their understanding is that there is a sort of continual working, I guess, of I'd say the Holy Spirit in the church, in guiding the church in all things towards truth. I think that's something that
absolutely,
especially within Protestantism, it seems that whenever there's any sort of disagreement that occurs, there's not a resolution to that disagreement. It's just a divergence to the point that now you have two different sects. And so I think, like, I know it's sort of a facile critique of Protestantism. I just think it's very applicable. It's something I see with my own eyes and can observe. Like, if Jesus says that he wants us to be in unity, then it seems like Protestantism is not a very good method by which for Jesus to structure his church. I think something much closer to Catholicism or Orthodoxy. So Orthodoxy was a church that for a long while I was very much looking into, and I still have great respect and love for my Orthodox brethren. And it's still something like, even as a Catholic, I'd want to defend Orthodoxy, especially if for some reason Protestants are just can't accept papal infallibility. That's something that's too far off the field for them. I'd at least definitely still want them to become Eastern Orthodox, because at least then you're closer to the fullness of truth, and you're still in communion with the saints, with the Christian heritage, the tradition. Yeah.
I also wanted to add a big reason why a lot of people, look down at the Catholic Church, and at certain points are refused to become Catholics, is because this is just because I study history, well, at least try to. In the 19th century, there were a lot of immigrants that came to America. And most of them were Catholics, and you already had a Protestant establishment in America. So that, and in Europe, you had a lot of anti-Catholic bigotry or anti-Catholic myths, like the Galileo affair, and that they pointed that out, and lots of other things, forgetting that the Christianity spurred on science and the university system and so much more. But you had a lot of these myths that were really by Protestants trying to undercut the Catholic Church. These immigrants coming to America, and a lot of a lot of it carries on to this day. Except it's not just Protestants who use these myths. It's really the secularists that are using a lot of these anti-Catholic myths or anti-Catholic bigotry. There's been a lot of books written on this. That's why I bring it up. But the more we look at tradition and so forth, and study history, a lot of these myths unravel. And so the reason I became a Catholic is because I just started studying more and more, and I was like, how did in 1517, or is it 1519? I always get those two dates confused. How did Martin Luther start another church when there was 1500 years before then? I just think if God really does exist, and if God raised Jesus from the dead, he would want his writings to be preserved. And I kept studying, and I uncovered a lot of these myths, and read a lot of books like, sorry guys, I should have had this ready. This one right here, by Thomas Woods, How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization. And Protestants had a lot to do with that too, but you've had a lot of anti-Catholic propaganda starting in the 19th century, which I guess that I kind of tacitly believed in some of these myths, and like a lot of my skepticism against the Catholic Church just started falling away. And so I continue to study philosophy and apologetics and try to seek the good, the beautiful, and the true in everything, even though I'm not perfect. But I try. I'm trying to be a saint, even though I may never get there. But that's why I'm Catholic.
Very good. Caleb, you had a comment on there. Did you want to sort of go over that?
Oh, there were a couple, but somebody asked for book recommendations for Protestants. That sounded a little biased, but yeah, here it is. So what's somebody or a book you'd recommend on the fence first? Yeah.
I don't know if I would recommend exactly a particular book on that. Like if somebody wants, like I would say, this is going to be sort of corny, but I'll follow sort of John Henry Newman's line and say to dive deep into history is to cease to be Protestant. I think while that's not exactly true, I do think that Protestants are so disconnected from the history of the Christian church that I think that if they were to like look into it, they would see a lot of commonality between the early church and the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. That should at least give them reason to double think or rethink their Protestantism that they might have just automatically grown up into. At least that's what it did for me. Of course, there's a multitude of sort of factors that sort of eventually led me into becoming Catholic, but that was definitely one of them, is wanting to get a better understanding of what was the historical Christianity that my tradition grew up out of.
And a lot of the reason I became Catholic is because of C.S. Lewis and Andrew Stratelates. Andrew Stratelates really brought me, because I used to be Baptist, and he really brought me out of that slumber by like looking at the high church. The author of this book, Peter Kraft, A Handbook of Christian Apologetics, really opened my eyes to a lot of the arguments, a different way of studying, a different way of conceptualizing Christianity other than like the William Lane Craig type arguments. But the Ed Fazer's or the Peter Kraft type books has really opened my eyes. But, a high church mentality or a C.S. Lewis, those really have brought me home to the Catholic Church. And if you're listening to this, I hope you consider afresh the Catholic Church and Jesus's his view, or what he said, that his church would never fade away.
What would you say, Caleb?
For books?
Or just recommended reading in general.
I like this book. I put it in the chat, Biblical Basis for the Catholic Faith. It's kind of simple, but that was the first book I read that kind of broke down like the scripture basis. Yes. Lamarin has it. Yeah, it's pretty accessible, and I mean there are probably a lot of books like it, but I like that one.
Nice. How do you feel about that, Andrew? Knowing that you're kind of a primary factor in Josh's crossing the Tiber here?
It's very consistent with my evangelism efforts. Someday I'm going to get an ethnic Jew to go into Jewish Orthodoxy, and my monkey paw style evangelism will be complete.
There you go.
But yeah,
Let me ask. Oh, I'm sorry.
yeah, and I'm in a different position than both Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodoxy in that Anglicanism does not make a claim of exclusivity. And a reasonable way to look at it is we think there are obvious divisions in the body of Christ here on earth, and there are some big chunks that get it mostly right. And I'm happy for anyone to sort of congregate and move towards unity in that sense.
Yeah. Well, what I was going to ask is, how do you think Catholics and other high church churchmen can unite against culture or against secular culture?
Sure. I've got some ideas there that have been brewing. One of the biggest things that we need to be able to do is provide a multitude of examples for individuals who are pious in the ancient Christian faith, but have a variety of levels of success or approaches or things like that, right? So that we want to make it very obvious that we're not Christians or members of the church because of some lack of worldly success. Or on the other hand, we don't want it to be because, it's a way to be worldly successful. And I think that's really important and something that's missing. And how to do that in a decentralized way is a really hard question, but that's one issue that is lacking, right? That if you don't have that variety of role models, it's very difficult for someone to feel they can maintain their faith and navigate the modern world.
I've recently, that you mentioned role models. I've recently been watching some of Bishop Robert Barron's videos on the saints. It's very inspiring. Saint Anselm, Saint Aquinas, of course, but there's so many others, and it's just been a gift. Those are role models rather than Justin Bieber or Snoop Dogg that a person should look up to. Thomas Aquinas, he mentions idols that people can come up with. He mentions four: wealth, power. I forgot the other one. Wealth, power. There's four, but wealth, power, fame, and honor. Okay, I believe those are the four. Those can be gods to people, false gods, and I think a person should always look inwardly. And when I look at the lives of the saints, they just live different lives, and that's what I want. That's what I think a person should want. Try to be as saintly as possible, but not compromise on doctrine, and not compromise and water down sin, but tell people that Christianity, specifically, I think, the Catholic Church, offers, a way to be rescued. That's what I think the biblical story is all about. You have the fall, you have creation, then you have man's fall, sin, and then you have redemption. I think the story of Jesus is, not being or being born in a manger, not being like an emperor. I think it's God's kind of secret operation to how to rescue mankind. That they called Christ Kyrios Kairos. No, I got that wrong. Does anybody know the Greek? It's Kyrios is Lord. Kyrios Jesus is what they called Jesus, and this was as opposed to Caesar, who was I forgot the name, but Kyrios Jesus, Lord Jesus. So Jesus serves as a different Lord of our lives rather than the gods of money, power, or sex. And Thomas Aquinas calls them, has different words for them. But I think money, power, sex, honor, pride, those are gods that can take over a person's life. And that's why they need to be guided by something, some principles, some first principles.
Now we had some questions. Okay, so this is CJ says the biggest divisions are papal authority, Mariology, I think he means saintly intercession, and communion. He says in that order, the need to be under Rome's authority is very problematic to me. So, do we have thoughts on that?
I'd have a sort of a basic thoughts on what is it? I think I'd have to let me find the exact place. But Jesus talks about he tells his apostles to obey the Pharisees because they sit upon the seat of Moses, but don't do what they do. Like they're hypocrites. So that's something that Jesus recognized regarding the Pharisees of his time. And so there's a sort of recognition of a certain authority that they held because they came from the same unbroken line from Moses. And so that gave them the authority by God to interpret the Torah and to sort of make decisions regarding the church. So that's also the blessing, I guess, given to the apostles that they'll have the power to bind and to loosen. That phrase there, to bind and to loosen, is very much a Hebrew idiom in regards to like making judgments in regards to how a person should live. I might not like it'll have multiple uses because like that term to bind and loosen is also in reference to their ability to forgive sins. But anyway, the point that I'm making there is that Jesus recognized that there was a type of ecclesial authority that the Pharisees had that he wanted to act in accordance with. Now, recognizing that authority that those original priests had was broken, and he instituted a new authority. At least that's within the Catholic understanding, through Peter and through Petrine succession, that not just from the seat of Moses, but rather from the seat of Peter. And then whatever authority that, so say those previous Pharisees might have had in to bind and loose, the Petrine succession would also have. And also the other apostles as well, because they have the power to bind and loosen, but within now the Catholic position, I'm not exactly sure the appropriate way to sort of describe it, but definitely is the understanding that there is a sort of the buck stops here in regards to the papal infallibility that he has. Now, like you can still have ecumenical councils that might take place, and they'll be binding because they have the bishops have that power to bind and to loosen. But if there's any sort of contention between, say, bishops, then there's going to be someone in which they can turn to in order to make a ruling, and that would be whoever holds the office of Pope. That's at least my sort of basic understanding of like how to explain, or at least to give some reasons as to why to think that there even is any sort of papal succession / authority that the Pope might have, or any of his Petrine successors.
Yeah, there's strong evidence on a sort of papal primacy, or primus inter pares, if you look at the early church. But there are significant nods to Alexandria, Constantinople, and other apostolic sees as well.
Antioch.
Antioch as well, yes. So, at least from the Anglican perspective, and most Eastern Orthodox would agree, is that there seems to be, and I'll use the Roman Catholic description to be polite, there's a clarification of the role of the Pope over the centuries and millennia that seems to really strengthen, at least from my perspective, the office of the papacy beyond what Peter had over the apostles. Because if we look at the biblical accounts and even the accounts of the early church, it doesn't seem like Peter had monarchical authority over the other apostles. And if you look at how Roman Catholicism tends to articulate Petrine authority and the authority of the Pope, it's as this monarchical authority. And that seems to be a disconnect to me. But I want to emphasize that the Bishop of Rome is a bishop, right? And the bishop is an overseer. And so he has some level of authority just based on that. And me and actually other Anglicans do read encyclicals with interest, just based on his bishopric authority, even if we don't accept that he has the sort of papal authority that Roman Catholics such as yourselves articulate.
Right. Yeah. I don't know. I wouldn't be able to go so much because I'm still very much there's a lot to the sort of history of the ecumenical councils that I'm just frankly not as familiar as I should be. But I do think that there is some, like as you had pointed out there, Andrew, and it is something that the Orthodox will definitely bring up as well. Instances of these councils taking place, even sort of absent, in a sense, a need for any sort of Petrine position there, that these sort of Petrine, these councils can take place and still be binding over the church. One of the things that, I don't know, this is, I guess, sort of a common sense maybe view that I might have that could probably be argued against, is just a thought of, suppose you have a certain amount of bishops and there's some sort of contention within the church, and there's a vast disagreement between the entire church over this position. I don't know, you could say contraception. You could say, like, maybe that's the sort of strong contention within the church, that there's not really a clear understanding on how are we supposed to understand this, especially since contraception isn't really something that the traditional or early church fathers had much familiarity or ability to speak about from their time period. So it's something that is sort of a pressing matter to the church, and a sort of need for some sort of decision to be made regarding this topic. And suppose that all the bishops of the various Christian churches are at a stalemate. There's a sort of imbalance between the two, or a balance between the two, saying, yeah, contraception is okay to some degree, or contraception is not okay to any degree. It seems like that would be a sort of poor decision-making apparatus if that contention within all these bishops just led to some sort of split, or just left up as something not to be, no judgments made upon, for that matter. I think there needs to be some sort of place in which the buck can stop somewhere without having to rely upon, like, okay, we're taking a certain amount of votes and, oh shoot, we have an even split. What are we supposed to do here? So that's at least why I think that there might be some reason to think that there is some higher authority to one of the bishops of the church than just the fact of sort of like first among equals that the Orthodox might hold to.
Yeah, well, and it basically gets fundamentally into the ontology of the church, right? One of the issues is, at least in the articulations that I've heard, is that the Pope basically has in his person all the authority of the church, in the same way that an absolute monarch has all the authority of the state in him. And that in some sense, it's only through the Pope delegating to the other bishops that these things occur. And,
right.
And there's trade-offs, right? A parliamentary system versus a monarchical system has trade-offs. The issue is a monarch might prevent deadlock, but a lot of it depends on the quality of the monarch. And there's the doctrine of papal infallibility is that the Pope will not make a mistake on doctrine when he's speaking ex cathedra, right? But at the same time, if you're using that sort of guarantee, why can't that guarantee apply to like the apostolic bishops in general, right? Or the church in general? And there are arguments where the delegation to the Pope and to Peter specifically is equivalent to David when I think it was David, or in the Old Testament, that the king gives some like authority to the head priest as the prime minister, which is logically possible. But that relies a lot on this context and traditional interpretation that doesn't seem clear to me and isn't actually preserved by the other churches, right? The ones that are in communion with the bishop in Rome affirm this stuff, but at the same time they also affirm all the things that were articulated at like Vatican I. Right. Basically everyone else, it seems like, doesn't affirm that and articulates something more of this peerage model. And you know, part of it is both of those are somewhat self-serving, right? Is that and this is the issue, right? Is since there's not unity, we can't really tell what the right answer is entirely.
Right. Yeah. So just for anyone that is curious, the reference back to the Old Testament he's referring to is in Isaiah 22, the particular verse is 22:22, but it's referring to Eliakim, where who's speaking here? I think this, the Lord speaking. I will clothe him with your robe and fasten your sash around him and hand your authority over to him. He will be a father to those who live in Jerusalem and to the people of Judah. I will place on his shoulder the key to the house of David. What he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open. I will drive him like a peg into a firm place. He will become a seat of honor for the house of his father. All the glory of his family will hang on him, its offspring and offshoots, all its lesser vessels, from the bowls to the jars. So that is definitely something that Suan Sona from Intellectual Conservatism, he definitely uses that in support of his sort of papal arguments, is drawing that connection between Christ giving Peter the keys and saying that whatever you bind in heaven, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. And then, of course, there is later in Matthew 18:18 where it talks about that same blessing is given upon the other apostles, without an explicit mention of a key, though, which I at least find somewhat interesting. As for having a sort of, I don't know, unified hierarchical system, I just sort of think back to Moses. They're like talking to God on the mountain, and that arrangement that was had there, where Moses, he was sort of like the direct mediator, I guess, between man and God, between God and man. But there was still the other, like the 70 elders that were still there, because like Moses wasn't going to be able to handle everything. And so there, if you needed some sort of problem, you would go to an elder. If they had some sort of problem, they would go to Moses. And I think if that's at least a biblical model that would be there in regards to how do we interpret Scripture, or in that time, how do we interpret the Torah and the laws given to us, and even like judgments could be made, because there was like an instance of a family who had only daughters, and whether those daughters could inherit their father's wealth, and that was something that was decided by Moses, I think, without even like having to commune with God in order to, or actually no, I think God did sort of approve of that sort of update or modification to the laws given at that time. So that's at least sort of my reason for thinking that there is a sort of living magisterium with some sort of head to it. I don't know, there's sort of a lot there, but that's at least where I would sort of start.
Yeah, well, I mean, a living magisterium with a head, right, is something that basically most sacramental Christians would affirm. The issues always end up being the details of what that headship is, right? Are we talking about something where it's something like the system of judges that the ancient Israel had, right? Where it's mostly decentralized, except on sort of an ad hoc basis? Or are we talking about something like the Davidic kingdom? Are we talking about the time of Moses? Because depending on the time, the headship, besides God being the head, right, it varies very dramatically in the shape and size it takes, at least in the kingdom of Israel.
Right. Yeah, one of the things that at least has off-put me somewhat from the Orthodox Church is given how disconnected the various bishops are from one another. It seems like if one bishop is running things some sort of way and another bishop says, like, notices that and is like, no, that's obviously wrong. You can't be doing that. That other bishop doesn't have any sort of authority to make judgments upon the other bishop's sort of authority. And like, I can understand that sort of decentralized aspect that's there, but I think that in a sense is still going to lead somewhat to a type of Protestantism, where you have each individual churches that is just sort of in charge of their own flock, and there is no real unity except for this sort of invisible unity that's there. But I don't know.
Well, then I'll ask you this: how much unity is there between like Jesuit policy and then FSSP or Opus Dei, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you're using that example of bishops disagreeing, but there are fundamental disagreements even within Roman Catholicism, even though they have what's institutional unity, right? That in theory everyone has the same CEO, but there are contentions there, and I am sympathetic to the ability of a more unified structure to maintain a sort of theological conservatism, but at the same time, the concern is sometimes, well, right, if it's guided by God, any system would work. But if it's not guided by God completely, any system's going to fail. And the question is just what failing modes we're going to run into fundamentally.
Yeah, that's a good place to sort of like in that sort of back and forth there. I think you brought up some good points Caleb, did you want to go into anything else? Why are you looking so sternly at us?
Oh, I was trying to read the side chat while I was far away, but no, I don't have anything. I know there was some chat going on about Matthew 16 and 18, also mentioning binding and loosing. Of course, the keys are only mentioned in 16, but I can see where, I've heard that before, like maybe the same application is applied to all the apostles. I don't know if you guys had thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the apostles do have the power to bind and loosen from Christ there, and I guess the Catholic position is that their authority is sort of derivative from the authority given to Peter, and I don't know, in a sense, I don't know how much the Orthodox would exactly agree with this, but it seems like an acknowledgement that Peter is the first among the apostles, and it is sort of a sense of the mouthpiece for the apostles, where anytime the apostles would have like some sort of question within them of like, how are we supposed to interpret this? Peter's the one that will vocalize those concerns to Christ. And then in that sense, there is that sort of, I don't know, I guess,
Yeah,
wouldn't exactly be a headship, but it would at least be a sort of primacy.
Well, in the first council in AD 49, it's Peter and James that are really the heads that it seems to me.
Yeah.
So already in that early date, 49, that's maybe 16 years after Jesus, after the crucifixion and resurrection. You already have that. But I can see both viewpoints on this. There's lots of viewpoints. I think one thing that is important, even though this may be unanswerable, which is the right view, the Catholic position, and I choose the Catholic position. I've made a choice, and I believe in. But we should all go back to church, history and tradition, and keep that close to us. That's all these things are important. When you disavow tradition and history, you end up with so you end up with some really off-putting Protestant denominations like Mormonism. It's not even Protestant, but if you don't have an authority there, or Jehovah Witnesses, that's why you have to look at the early church, the traditions, the history, that living tradition that it's not just a few little documents. It's a living tradition that we can trace back to the first pope, and I really do believe that. And
yeah. I think, at least for myself, in first sort of like questioning Catholicism, there was a lot of like, I guess, sort of a confusion as to what exactly the role of the Pope had. Like, what was it? Anything that Pope Francis said is suddenly binding for all Christians anywhere? That sort of like a immediate sort of Protestant assumption that I might have had. Michael Lofton, his channel Reason and Theology, he has a lot of like good sort of discussions regarding what is the magisterium, when is it, like, how are we supposed to understand when, like, the vast differences, say, between Vatican I and Vatican II, how are those congruent with one another? I find it very interesting, and it gives a lot of answers, I think, to how are we supposed to understand the magisterium at work, even when, like, it seems that there's a type of contention between, like, something a pope said in his writing at one point and another pope, say, a few successions after the fact, that is in disagreement to that. Which one has a sort of higher supremacy to one another, given the type of writing that it is. Like, was it something that was put out as an encyclical, or was it something that was just sort of private theology that a particular pope was doing? I think it gives a lot of good answers to how are we supposed to understand the magisterium at work in a way that's not black and white.
So my very obnoxious Anglican take is this, that anything Pope Francis says should be taken as what the Bishop of Rome is saying unless otherwise proven. Right? Yeah. So yeah, basically that would solve most of the problems. If you just take it as the Bishop of Rome is saying such and such, then you will not run into issues most of the time.
Right, but I mean, even like if I was to take this sort of the orthodox position that each bishop has sort of like their own authority over their region, then I would still be bound to whatever but that's the thing, like, just because Pope Francis says something doesn't mean that like that something is now universally binding over the entirety of his church. It's only when Pope Francis is like, sure, when he's saying that, like, we should like end the death penalty, that's something sort of a imperative command but it's also something that he put into effect through the catechism as well, that there's different things, there's different levels of what the Pope says that we have to take into consideration for our what we're bound to and what we're not. I
think we can have legitimate disagreements with the Pope on particular issues and not be heretics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anyway,
what would you say, John? Yeah, I know we probably need to wrap this up within about, I don't know, soon. What would you say, John, about just to and Andrew, I want your take also about a radical Protestant who says we just need to look at the Bible. The Bible has the answers. We don't need to look at tradition or the or history. We just need to look at the Bible. What would you say to that modern portrait? John, go ahead.
Well, you have to think about, like, well, what language was the Bible written in, for one, and like the fact that you're reading a Bible in English is you relying upon some sort of tradition that translated that original Greek writing into an English writing, and so that's, in a sense, you're trusting upon this broader community than just you in this collection of texts that's there. So that's at least some area in which there is a reliance upon the tradition and a community that you're relying upon, even in just the fact that you have the King James Bible right there and you're reading it in English. But I think there's more to it than that as well. Sort of like what Andrew was saying there, I'm going to steal that. Like, just reading Grey's Anatomy doesn't suddenly make you a doctor. But going to medical school, learning from a practicing actual doctor, and then having him sort of there watching over your shoulder and like guiding you through these sorts of things, that's how you become a doctor. So now I just sort of stole Andrew's response. Right, you can go ahead.
I have another one. So,
there you go. Perfect.
When you come into any text, you bring a context of your understanding of your presuppositions and the culture and things like that, right? And if you come from a Christian culture that is very Christian and read the Bible, you'll probably do a reasonable job, right? But our pop culture is not fundamentally Christian. And so there are lots of errors that modern people have made, and you actually have to go back deeper to look at this in a different way and change your entire worldview to really understand it. And that's what I would say, is that reading it alone usually won't be enough. It might give you impetus to look into these other things, but you'll bring a lot of mistakes and a lot of presuppositions, right? There's a great example from Axe Cop, which is a great comic series written by like a 6-year-old and a 26-year-old. And Axe Cop goes underwater, and everyone scowls at him. So he like fights them because they're bad guys. And underwater, in the underwater world, scowling is how you smile, right? And smiling is what it means to scowl. And a lot of what your interpretation of the Bible will be, or any classical text, will have that type of distortions in it, unless you imbue yourself in the civilization and how the civilization thinks as you're reading it.
I've when I've dialogued, I've often talked a lot about perception and how our perceptual abilities are limited. We only see things in a range of 360 to 720 millimicrons, and we only hear sounds in a particular range in the hertz range. And if you back up or get closer to something, you see things in a different way. So because of our very natures, they're limited. So I think a lot of objections against religion in general and Christianity in particular, they're not looking at the whole picture, but are stuck in the woods, not looking for the particular thing, not looking for the context or the trees, or they're somewhere else. They're not in the right perceptual framework.
Yeah, that's a great point. Just the mere fact that we are limited beings, we depend upon each other in order to exist, and like I see no reason to think that that's suddenly not going to be true in regards to our understanding of the scripture that has been given to us. And yeah, I think we're still very much dependent upon others for this. And you want to make sure that the community that you're dependent upon is something that has its sort of heritage within the historical community of Christians. And I think that Orthodoxy and Catholicism and Coptic Christians as well, and I don't know, that I guess somewhat the Anglicans, but I might bristle a bit at that, have that sort of historical continuity with the early church. And so I think that gives them a type of, I don't know, that gives them a certain higher weight, I guess, if you're to be weighing the various Christian traditions against each other.
Peter Kraft, well, by the way, I've mentioned this book, but this is a handbook of Christian apologetics by Peter Kraft, and this he was a Catholic. He recently passed away, but I've learned so much, just from a Catholic perspective. I've read, so many Protestant philosophy books and apologetic books, but this book, Peter Kraft and Bishop Robert Barron, they're great intellectuals and show that the Catholic Church, or the High Church at least, like C.S. Lewis presented, has so much to offer our culture, so much to offer people. We all have problems, right? We all have anxiety. We all have things in our life, but just knowing that there is a God, knowing that there is a church, knowing that the church is built on traditions, without we live, like you said, John, and what you're quoting Aquinas, right? That we live on the shoulders of giants, but there's a long tradition that we can fall back on, and we can see that, in culture, the beauty, the truth, the goodness of certain things. And Paul says those things are good. Those things. I forgot how Paul puts it, but I think I think there are a lot of resources out there. This one in particular, and Bishop Robert Barron's resources, I think, are a good place to go for a person that's seeking truth. And I just want to strongly recommend that. I've recently come to the Catholic Church, and I never thought I would be a Catholic. And I think C.S. Lewis, I think Andrew Stratelates as much as C.S. Lewis. I just am honored, where I am, and hope to keep growing in my knowledge of God.
Amen.
Yeah, I just want to make a clarifying point, Josh. Thank you for that. But Peter Kraft actually hasn't passed away yet.
Oh, he hasn't. Okay, but he is Catholic.
Yeah, he is Catholic and he is old, but he hasn't.
I shouldn't. I'm sorry. I thought he did, but that's. I retract that. We. Sorry for that.
Oh, it's fine. All right, we should probably wrap it up in a couple minutes. I don't know if everybody wants to give their last thoughts.
Oh, that was mine.
Yeah. How about you, Caleb? What are your sort of thoughts?
Oh, I already shared my thoughts, so I'd recommend. Well, anyways, I was gonna plug one of my videos, but yeah, I
Which
did
one?
plug. Both my video on the Eucharist and the Immaculate Conception. Those are the two doctrines I've looked into the most in terms of defending. So I made videos on those. So that's what I'll plug. You
know what? Let me just say one brief thing. That'll take just 5 minutes. No, it'll just take 30 seconds or so. I hope I hope we can discuss again, and I don't know, possibly change the subject, or expand, or maybe go to high church or Catholicism or something like that confronts culture, or Catholicism or the church myths about the church, or something. I think as Christians, and we should engage culture, and it's good. We should be in community with other believers, us. And I think God called us together right now just to discuss these things, and I hope to to be here again with all you three. And it's been a delight, and I thank you so much.
Yeah. It's been a great talking to you guys. This has been fun. Yeah, this is my first sort of online conversation since my conversion to Catholicism. So it's been cool to be able to talk about it with you guys. So I'm John Buck. I'm on Twitter @writer John Buck. I have a YouTube channel that I don't post anything on for like a year and a half or maybe 2 years now. But I still have a video in the works that I'll eventually get put out, and then from there I'll hopefully post more regularly. But I don't know. So yeah, that's my next video will be on epistemology, but happy to be Catholic.
Well, congratulations and God bless you all. And that's my final thought.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in, and yeah, we'll have more discussions at some point. But all right. Well, have a good night.